Imagine you are standing on a wooden plank. You are in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. It is November. The water temperature is 2 degrees above freezing. The air temperature is 10 degrees below zero. And you are wet. Soaking wet. Now look around you. There is no cabin. There is no below decks. There is no roof over your head. There is just an open deck exposed to the sky, the wind, and the freezing spray of the waves. You are on a Viking longship, the most advanced piece of naval technology of the Middle Ages, but also the most uncomfortable place on Earth. For weeks, you will not see land. You will not feel dry skin. And most terrifying of all, you cannot light a fire. If you light a fire on this ship, the wind will blow the sparks into the tar-covered wood, and you will burn to death in the middle of a freezing ocean. So, how did they do it? How did these men cross the icy void to discover Iceland, Greenland, and America without dying of hypothermia in the first 48 hours? The answer lies in a forgotten piece of leather technology, a diet of pure grease, and a sleeping habit that would make a modern soldier claustrophobic. We are about to step aboard the Dragon ship and discover the cold, wet, and brutal reality of Viking ocean travel. To understand how a human being survives a voyage across the North Atlantic in the year 1000 AD, we first have to destroy a popular image. When we think of ships, we think of cabins. We think of the Santa Maria of Columbus or the galleons of the pirates with their captain's quarters, below-deck hammocks, and dry storage rooms. We assume that a ship is a floating house. The Viking longship, the Drakkar, was not a house. It was not even a boat in the modern sense. It was a 30-meter-long open-air canoe. When you stepped aboard a Viking ship, you were leaving the concept of indoors behind completely. There was no roof. There was no lower deck to crawl into when it started raining. From the moment the ship pushed off from the coast of Norway until the moment it hopefully spotted the glaciers of Iceland weeks later, you were outside. You were exposed to the troposphere 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This design was intentional. The Vikings prioritized speed and shallow draft over comfort. They wanted a ship that could slide up a river in France or beach itself on a sandy shore in Scotland. To achieve this, they stripped away everything that wasn't essential. They removed the weight. They removed the height. They removed the shelter. The result was a masterpiece of engineering that was also a thermal death trap. Let's look at the physics of your position on the deck. The freeboard, the distance from the waterline to the top edge of the ship, was terrifyingly low. On a fully loaded longship carrying warriors, cargo, and livestock, the gunwale might be only a few feet above the ocean surface. This means you weren't just sailing on the ocean. You were practically sailing in the ocean. Every time the ship cut through a wave, or every time the wind whipped the tops off the whitecaps, a freezing mist of salt water would spray the entire length of the deck. This wasn't a refreshing splash. In the North Atlantic, the water temperature hovers just above freezing. Salt water has a lower freezing point than fresh water, meaning the spray hitting your face could be liquid at minus 2 degrees Celsius. This constant dampness is the primary enemy. In a survival situation, water is the thief of heat. Water conducts heat away from the human body 25 times faster than air. If you stand naked in 0-degree air, you will be miserable, but you might survive for hours. If you fall into 0-degree water, or if your clothes are soaked through with it, you have minutes before your muscles seize up and your brain functions shut down. On a long ship, staying dry was impossible. The spray came from the sides, the rain and sleet came from above, and the water came from below. The deck boards of a Viking ship were not sealed watertight like a modern yacht floor. They were loose planks that could be lifted up to access the storage space below. Beneath your feet, in the bilge, was a constant pool of freezing, filthy water, a mixture of seawater, urine, and animal waste, sloshing back and forth with every roll of the ship. The dampness rose up through the cracks. You were essentially living inside a wet sponge. Then, you have to factor in the wind. A Viking ship was fast. With a strong following wind, it could reach speeds of 10 to 12 knots. But often, the wind wasn't behind you. It was cutting across the beam. Let's do the math on the wind chill factor. If the ambient air temperature is a manageable -5 degrees Celsius, but the wind is blowing at 30 kilometers per hour, a standard stiff breeze at sea, the air hitting your skin feels like -15 degrees. If a gale picks up, that effective temperature drops to -30 degrees. At -30 degrees wind chill, exposed skin develops frostbite in under 30 minutes. The Vikings didn't have neoprene masks. They didn't have Gore-Tex windbreakers, they had beards and wool. Standing at the steering oar or manning the sheets meant standing in a wind tunnel designed to strip the heat from your core, and there was no escape. This is the psychological horror of the longship. On a modern ship, when your shift is over, you go below decks, you dry off, you get a hot coffee. On a Viking ship, when your shift ended, you simply sat down on your sea chest, a wooden box containing your worldly possessions, right there on the same freezing deck. You were wet, you were cold, and you were motionless. Motion generates heat. When you are rowing or pulling ropes, your muscles are burning calories and keeping you warm. But you can't row forever. Eventually, you have to sleep. And sleep is when the cold kills you. As your metabolism slows down to rest, your internal furnace drops. If you fall asleep in wet clothes in a sub-zero wind without protection, you don't wake up. You simply drift from sleep into hypothermia and then into death. The Vikings knew this. They knew that the ocean was a heat sink, a massive entity trying to equalize your temperature with its own. And since the ocean was 2 degrees, equalization meant death. So the logical solution would be to create heat. Build a fire, warm up the air, dry the clothes. Cook a hot meal to warm the belly. Every civilization that has ever survived the cold has done so by mastering fire. But here is the cruelest irony of the Viking Age. The people who mastered the ocean, the people who lived in the frozen north, were strictly forbidden from using the one tool that could save them. On the open sea, the longship was a no-fire zone. Why? Why would they choose to freeze rather than light a simple brazier to warm their hands? The answer isn't stubbornness. It is a terrifying reality of naval chemistry that turned their ships into floating incendiary bombs. To understand why they couldn't have heat, we have to understand what the ship was made of. And it wasn't just wood. It is a question that plagues every modern person who looks at a museum reconstruction of a Viking ship. Why didn't they just bring a stove? The Vikings were master smiths. They could forge iron that rivaled the best steel in the world. They had cauldrons. They had tripods. They knew how to contain fire in stone hearths back in their longhouses. Surely on a voyage that lasted weeks across a freezing ocean, they could have built a small enclosed iron box to burn peat or charcoal. Just a little heat to dry their gloves? Just a small flame to boil water? The answer is a hard, absolute no. And the reason wasn't a lack of technology. It was a terrifying reality of chemistry. The Viking longship was not just made of wood. It was effectively a floating incendiary bomb. To understand why, you have to smell a Viking ship. If you were to stand next to a replica today, the first thing that hits you is the scent of pine tar. It is a sharp, smoky, chemical smell. As we mentioned in previous stories, the Vikings waterproofed their ships with jeru, a resin distilled from burning pine roots. This tar is incredible at keeping water out, but it has a secondary property that is a nightmare at sea. It is highly flammable. The hull planks were painted with it. The wool that caulked the gaps between the planks was soaked in it. The entire vessel was essentially dipped in fuel. But the danger didn't stop at the hull. Look up at the sail. The massive square sail, the engine of the ship, was made of wool. But untreated wool gets heavy when wet and lets the wind pass through. To make it airtight and water-resistant, the Vikings treated the sail with a mixture of animal fats, horse fat or seal blubber, mixed with ochre and more tar. So you have a hull coated in resin and a sail soaked in grease. Now, add the rigging. The ropes were made of hemp or bass lime tree fibers, which, when dry, are excellent kindling. Now, imagine trying to light a fire in this environment. You are in the middle of the North Atlantic. The ship is pitching violently, rolling 20 degrees to the left, then 20 degrees to the right. The wind is gusting unpredictably. If you light a fire in a brazier, and the ship hits a rogue wave, a single glowing coal, just one, rolling across the deck is a catastrophe. If that coal lodges itself between two deck planks, right into the tar-soaked wool caulking, it won't just smolder. It will catch. The draft from the wind will act like a bellows, feeding oxygen to the flame. Within seconds, the floor you are standing on is on fire. In the modern world, a fire on a boat is an emergency. You call the Coast Guard. You deploy life rafts. You use fire extinguishers. In the year 1000 AD, a fire on a ship was an execution. There were no radios. There were no fire extinguishers. And, crucially, there were no lifeboats. The longship was the lifeboat. If the ship burned, you went into the water. And, as we established in Chapter 1, the water is a killer. You would have a choice between burning to death or freezing to death in 3 minutes. Because of this, the no-fire rule was strictly enforced. It was likely a capital offense to strike a spark on deck while under sail. The discipline required was immense. Imagine being wet, shivering uncontrollably, your hands numb, and seeing a pile of dry wood and a flint striker right there. You have the power to create warmth, but you are forbidden by the laws of the ship to use it. This meant that the longship was a cold iron environment. They carried great iron cauldrons, yes. They carried tripods. But during the ocean crossing, these tools sat in the bottom of the hull, cold and useless, mocking the crew. They were dead weight, only to be used once they reached land. This prohibition on fire fundamentally changed the daily existence of the sailor. It meant that for the duration of the voyage, there was no cooking. Think about what that does to the morale of a human being. There was no hot porridge in the morning to wake you up. There was no hot stew in the evening to settle your stomach. There was no hot water to wash your face. For 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or even a month, everything you put into your body was the same temperature as the air around you, freezing. Their diet at sea was strictly cold rations. They ate stockfish, that rock-hard dried cod we talked about, which they had to smash and chew raw. They ate hardtack dry flatbread. They drank water from barrels that was often icy, or weak ale that offered calories, but no warmth. It was a test of psychological endurance as much as physical. Hot food is a comfort. It signals safety. To be denied heat, both vertically from the sun/fire and internally from food, strips away the feeling of civilization. It reduces the human to a biological machine that simply processes calories to keep the core temperature above 35 degrees Celsius. But there was one exception. A tiny loophole in the rule. The Vikings were coastal navigators whenever possible. If they were sailing along the coast of Norway or island hopping through the Shetlands, they would put into shore at night. They would beach the ship or anchor in a dead calm cove. Only then, when the sail was lowered and furled away, and the ship was stable, might they set up a tent on the deck or on the land and light a fire. But on the deep ocean crossings, the blue water voyages to Iceland or America, there was no land, there was no stopping. For those voyages, the fire remained extinguished. The night did not bring warmth, it only brought blindness. So, if you cannot heat the ship, and you cannot heat the food, how do you stop the crew from dying? The human body generates about 100 watts of heat at rest. In the wind and spray, that heat is stripped away instantly. To survive, the Vikings had to trap that heat before the wind could steal it. They had to invent a way to recycle their own energy. They couldn't rely on the sun, and they couldn't rely on fire. They had to rely on the skin of another animal, and the body of another man. They had to create a human battery. Let's crawl into the dark, smelly, and claustrophobic solution that saved the Vikings from the ice. The sun has set. The horizon is a blur of gray water and black sky. The temperature is plummeting. You have just finished a 4-hour shift at the steering oar, standing motionless in the freezing spray. Your hands are numb, your beard is crusted with salt ice, and your wool tunic is damp. You are shivering violently, the uncontrollable shaking that signals the early stages of hypothermia. You need heat immediately. But there is no fire, there is no lower deck, there is no hot water, so you do the only thing you can do. You find your partner. You walk over to a large, stiff, smelly sack made of treated leather lying on the deck boards. You open the mouth of the sack, and you crawl inside, right next to another grown man. This is the secret of Viking survival at sea. It wasn't stoicism, it was the hufat. The hufat, roughly translating to hide sack, was the ancestor of the modern sleeping bag, but to compare it to a camping accessory is a disservice. It was a piece of survival technology as advanced for its time as a spacesuit. Made from the skins of sheep, seals, or even reindeer, it was designed with the fur facing inward to trap air, and the leather facing outward. The exterior was treated with oils, fats, and tar. The same waterproofing used on the ship itself, making it resistant to the spray and rain. But the brilliance of the hujufat wasn't the material, it was the capacity. These bags were often designed to hold 2 men. This wasn't a shortage of materials. It was a calculation of thermodynamics. A single human body sleeping alone in a cold environment is a losing battle. You are a radiator. You are constantly emitting heat into the air around you. If you sleep alone in a bag, your body has to work overtime to heat up the air inside that bag. If the bag is too big, or if the insulation fails, the cold air wins. You wake up shivering, having burned through your caloric reserves, just trying to stay neutral. But if you put 2 human bodies in the same confined space, the physics change. Now you have 2 radiators. The surface area of heat generation doubles, but the volume of air that needs to be heated remains largely the same. The bodies insulate each other. The heat lost by one man is absorbed by the other. It creates a thermal feedback loop. So, the Vikings practiced what we might call tactical spooning. It sounds funny to the modern ear, but on the North Atlantic, it was a matter of life and death. They would sleep back to chest, packing themselves tightly into the leather cocoon. The man in the back acted as a shield for the man in front, warming his spine and kidneys. After a few hours, or halfway through the sleep shift, they might rotate. It was an intimate, claustrophobic, and absolutely necessary existence. Personal space did not exist. Privacy did not exist. To survive the voyage, you had to be willing to press your freezing body against the body of your shipmate. This physical closeness likely forged a bond between the crew that went far deeper than friendship. You were literally keeping each other alive with your own metabolism. And let's be honest about the sensory reality of this. It was disgusting. Imagine the smell. 2 men who haven't bathed in weeks, wearing damp wool that smells like wet dog, covered in salt spray, unwashed hair, and fish oil. They crawl into a leather bag that has been used by other men for weeks, which also smells of rancid seal fat and tar. They seal the opening to keep the heat in. The air inside that bag would be thick, humid, and foul. It was an incubator of bacteria and odors. But to a freezing Viking, that smell was perfume. It was the smell of warmth. It was the only place in the entire world where the temperature was above freezing. Climbing into that bag, feeling the sensation of blood returning to your fingers and toes, must have been a moment of pure ecstasy, regardless of the stench. This system also relied on the concept of the hot bunk. A Viking ship operates on watches. The ship never stops. Someone always has to be awake to steer, to watch for icebergs, to trim the sail. This meant the crew was split into shifts. When your watch began, you would crawl out of the hufat. As you exited, your replacement, frozen from his 4 hours on deck, would immediately crawl in. This was genius. The sleeping bag never had time to get cold. The leather and fur retained the heat of the previous occupants. The new sleeper didn't have to waste precious calories heating up a cold bag. He was sliding into a preheated oven. The battery was always charged. In calmer waters, or when anchored, they had a secondary layer of defense, the jold. This was a tent structure. They would take the yardarm or oars, prop them up, and drape a heavy wool or canvas cloth over the deck. This created a triangular tent. The jold didn't provide heat. Remember, no fires allowed, but it stopped the wind. By eliminating the wind chill, the ambient temperature on the deck rose a few degrees. Inside the tent, inside the hufat, huddled together, the crew could create a microclimate that was surprisingly survivable. However, this method of sleeping created a new problem, a biological problem. When you are cold, you burn calories at an alarming rate. Shivering alone can triple your metabolic rate. Generating enough body heat to warm yourself and your partner in a sleeping bag requires fuel, massive amounts of fuel. You cannot run a furnace on empty. If the Vikings didn't eat enough, their internal fires would go out. They would stop generating heat and they would freeze to death inside the bag. But as we know, they couldn't cook, they couldn't boil potatoes or bake bread. They needed a food source that was dense, portable, didn't require cooking, and provided explosive amounts of energy. They found the answer in the ocean itself. They fueled their bodies with the most energy-dense substance available to medieval man. It was greasy, it was repulsive, and it was absolutely vital. To keep the human battery running, they had to drink the oil. To survive the North Atlantic in an open boat, you have to fundamentally change your relationship with food. In the modern world, we eat for flavor, for texture, or for social connection. We worry about carbs. We count calories to make sure we don't eat too many. On a Viking longship, the math is reversed. You are not eating to enjoy yourself. You are eating to stop your heart from stopping. Let's look at the caloric math of the cold. A standard adult male needs about 2,500 calories a day to function in a temperate climate. But when you expose that same man to freezing winds, constant shivering, and the heavy physical labor of rowing a multi-ton oak ship through heavy swells, his metabolic demand skyrockets. He doesn't need 2,500 calories. He needs 5,000, maybe 6,000. He is burning energy just to keep his blood liquid. If he falls behind on that caloric debt, hypothermia accelerates. The body shuts down blood flow to the hands and feet to protect the core. He becomes weak, clumsy, and eventually dead. So, how do you pack 6,000 calories a day into a ship with limited cargo space, no refrigeration, and no way to cook? You can't do it with bread. You can't do it with vegetables. You need the most energy-dense substance found in nature. You need pure fat. The Viking diet at sea was a nightmare for a modern cardiologist, but a miracle for a cold-weather sailor. The centerpiece of their survival rations was semur, butter. But this wasn't the sweet, creamy butter we buy in the supermarket. The Vikings produced butter in industrial quantities and cured it with salt so it would last for months, or even years, without spoiling. They valued it so highly that it was often used as currency. Taxes were paid in butter. On the ship, butter wasn't a condiment. You didn't spread it thinly on a piece of bread. The butter was the meal. A sailor might be issued a ration of butter that he would eat in chunks, like cheese, or simply swallow whole. Fat contains 9 calories per gram, compared to 4 calories for protein or carbohydrates. It is the rocket fuel of the biological world. When you swallow a lump of cold, salted butter, your digestive system has to work hard to break it down. This process, called thermogenesis, actually generates internal body heat. By flooding their systems with lipids, the Vikings were literally stoking their internal furnaces. They were creating the meat sweats on purpose, just to survive the night watch. But you cannot live on grease alone. You need a vehicle for the fat, and you need protein to repair the muscles torn by rowing. For this, they turned to the most durable food item ever invented, turfisk or stockfish. We mentioned this in the winter survival story, but on a ship, stockfish takes on a new level of importance. This is cod that has been dried in the freezing wind until it has the consistency of a baseball bat. It is 80% protein. It is light, it floats, and it never rots. You could stack it in the open hull of a wet ship for a month, and it would be perfectly edible. However, edible is a strong word. You cannot just bite into a piece of stockfish. It is as hard as wood. To eat it, the sailors had to perform a daily ritual. They would take a piece of the dried fish and smash it against the gunwale of the ship, or beat it with the pommel of their knife or a specialized hammer. They had to pulverize the fibers to soften them. Then, they would take this fibrous, fishy, dry wool and slather it in the butter or sour whey. The combination, massive protein and massive fat, is the ultimate survival bar. It provides slow-burning energy that keeps the body warm for hours. In the most extreme latitudes, when they ventured toward Greenland or the Arctic Circle, they supplemented this with marine mammals. Seal blubber and whale meat. This is where the diet becomes truly testing. Marine fat is different from dairy fat. It is rich in omega-3s, yes, but when preserved and eaten cold, it has a rancid, fishy potency that coats the mouth and throat. Yet, for a Viking shivering in the spray, a strip of seal blubber was a lifeline. It was essentially an edible candle. But there is a dark side to this diet. Eating high-fat, cold food while rocking violently on the ocean is a recipe for catastrophic seasickness. Digestion slows down in the cold. The stomach rebels. Vomiting on a longship was dangerous, not only because it was messy in a crowded space, but because it expelled the precious calories you just fought to consume. If you couldn't keep the butter down, you couldn't stay warm. The veterans knew this. They had to force themselves to eat, and force themselves to keep it down, suppressing the nausea through sheer will. Then there was the problem of hydration. This is the great paradox of the sea. Water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. The ocean is salt. You cannot drink it. It will shut down your kidneys and drive you mad. You also cannot eat the sea ice or the snow that lands on the deck. Eating snow lowers your core body temperature. It costs the body heat to melt the snow into water, heat that you cannot spare. So, they had to bring fresh water. They stored it in large wooden casks called vats. But in the North Atlantic, fresh water freezes. Imagine the struggle. You are thirsty. You go to the water barrel. But the top is a solid block of ice. You have to smash through it to get to the liquid below. And when you drink it, the water is effectively 0 degrees Celsius. Every sip you take sends a shock of cold straight to your core, undoing the work your layers of wool and fat have done. To combat this, and to keep the water from turning into a solid block, they often mixed it with alcohol. Weak ale or mead has a lower freezing point than water. They also drank syrah, the sour whey byproduct of cheese making. It was acidic, which kept the water from stagnating with bacteria, and it didn't freeze as easily. But make no mistake, for weeks on end, they were dehydrated. They lived in a state of constant thirst, sipping slushy, sour water just enough to stay alive, fearful of cooling their bodies down too much. This combination, a diet of cold fat, hard fish, and freezing sour water, kept the furnace burning. It kept the muscles moving. It kept the brain awake. But while the diet saved them from hypothermia, the ocean had other ways to attack them. The cold was one enemy. The salt was another. There is a specific medical horror that happens to a human body when it is wet for too long. Your skin is not waterproof. It is semi-permeable. When you soak your feet and hands in salt water for 10 days straight, strange things begin to happen. The skin begins to die while it is still attached to you. The leather cocoon kept them warm, but it also trapped the moisture. They were marinating in their own sweat and the sea spray. And as the voyage dragged on into its second or third week, the crew began to suffer from a condition that could cripple a man without breaking a bone. The Vikings called it sea sore. We call it trench foot. And on a longship where there is no dry land to step on, there is no cure. The ocean does not need to drown you to kill you. It does not even need to freeze you. Sometimes it just needs to touch you. For a long enough time, we have talked about the cold. We have talked about the hunger. But there is a third torture on a Viking longship that is rarely discussed in the history books because it is not glorious. It isn't heroic. It is biological, smelly, and excruciatingly painful. It is the destruction of the human skin. To understand this, look at your own hand. If you stay in the bathtub for an hour, your fingers prune. This is called maceration. The skin absorbs water, swells, and becomes soft. Now imagine you don't get out of the bathtub. Imagine you stay in that water for 14 days. And imagine the water is freezing salt brine, mixed with sand and bilge filth. The skin doesn't just prune. It begins to dissolve. The Viking warrior, for all his strength, was wearing technology on his feet that was surprisingly fragile. Viking boots or sko were not made of rubber or Gore-Tex. They were made of leather, usually goat or cowhide, sewn together using a turn-shoe technique. They were treated with beeswax and tar to make them water-resistant, but water-resistant is not waterproof. Standing in the bilge of a longship or taking constant waves over the gunwale meant that the leather eventually saturated. Once wet, leather stays wet. For the entire voyage to Iceland, a Viking's feet were encased in a cold, soggy, shrinking clamp of dead animal skin. This created the perfect breeding ground for what we now call immersion foot or trench foot. It starts with numbness. The cold water constricts the blood vessels in the feet to save heat. The feet turn pale, then blue. The nerves stop sending signals. At first, this feels like a blessing. The pain of the cold disappears. You can't feel your toes anymore, so you stop worrying about them. You stomp around the deck on wooden stumps, doing your job. But inside the boot, a catastrophe is happening. The lack of blood flow and the constant moisture cause the tissue to break down. The skin turns white and waxy. Blisters form, filled with clear fluid. If the condition continues, the skin actually separates from the deep layers. It begins to slough off, like a wet sock sliding off a foot. In extreme cases, gangrene sets in. The flesh dies, it turns black, and in a crowded ship, you would smell it before you saw it. But the true horror of immersion foot isn't the numbness. It is the rewarming. When the shift ended and the Viking crawled into the leather sleeping bag with his partner, his feet would slowly warm up. The blood vessels would dilate. The blood would rush back into the damaged tissue. This is not a relief. It is agony. Survivors of this condition describe it as feeling like having your feet held in a fire. The itching and the burning are maddening. Men would weep in their sleep, thrashing against the leather bag, unable to escape the pain of their own circulation returning. And it wasn't just the feet. The ocean attacks every inch of skin it touches. Salt water is abrasive. When seawater dries on your skin or clothes, it leaves behind salt crystals. These crystals are microscopic shards of glass. Now, add a layer of heavy, coarse wool rubbing against that salted skin for 24 hours a day as you row. The result is saltwater sores. These are deep, chafing ulcers that form at the friction points. The neck, the wrists, the armpits, and the inner thighs. They bleed. And because you are constantly covered in salt spray, the salt gets into the open wounds. It is a literal interpretation of rubbing salt in the wound. These sores would not heal at sea. They would fester, ooze, and sting with every movement of the oar. To make matters worse, hygiene on a longship was a logistical impossibility. The Vikings were famously clean people on land. They bathed weekly, combed their hair daily, and prized grooming. But on a blue water crossing, civilization collapsed. There were no bathrooms on a drakkar. There was a bucket, a wooden bucket, usually kept near the mast or the gunwale. Using it in a storm while the ship pitched 20 degrees was a feat of acrobatics and humiliation. Often, with the waves crashing over the deck, the contents of the bucket, or the contents of a seasick stomach, would wash into the bilge water swirling around their feet. So, the water soaking their boots wasn't just sterile seawater. It was a toxic soup of bacteria. If you had a cut on your ankle, or a saltwater sore on your leg, infection was almost guaranteed. A simple scratch could turn into a septic death sentence in days. This physical degradation, the rotting feet, the bleeding sores, the constant filth, created a desperate psychological state. We often wonder why the Vikings were so aggressive when they landed. Why were they so terrifying? Imagine the mindset of a man who has just endured 3 weeks of this. He's in constant pain. He hasn't slept more than 2 hours at a time. He's covered in his own filth. His feet feel like blocks of ice or burning coals. He is fueled by rancid butter and anger. When that ship finally hits the gravel of a foreign beach, he isn't just looking for gold. He is looking for a fire. He is looking for dry land. He is looking for release. The violence of the raid was, in part, the venting of the torture of the voyage. But before they could land, before they could dry their boots and heal their sores, they had to find the land. And this brings us to the greatest mystery of Viking navigation. The North Atlantic is not just cold, it is foggy. In the summer months, thick banks of white fog roll off the glaciers and blanket the ocean. You can't see the horizon. You can't see the stars. You can't see the sun. For a sailor in the year 1000, losing the sky meant losing the world. They didn't have magnetic compasses. Those wouldn't arrive in Europe for another 2 centuries. They navigated by the position of the sun and the North Star Polaris. So, what happens when the fog rolls in for 4 days straight? What happens when the world turns into a white void and you are spinning in the middle of the ocean, rotting alive, with no idea where north is? If you guess wrong, you miss Iceland. You miss Greenland. You sail into the empty oblivion of the Arctic until you starve. To survive the whiteout, the Vikings utilized a tool that historians thought was a myth for 100 years. A magic crystal mentioned in the sagas. A stone that could find the sun even when it was invisible. It sounds like fantasy. But modern science has proven that the sunstone was real, and it relied on a property of light that the human eye cannot see. Let's look through the crystal and find the way home. The ocean has many faces. There is the angry face of the storm, which tries to break the ship. There is the freezing face of the spray, which tries to break the body. But the most terrifying face of the North Atlantic is the one that has no features at all, the fog. To a modern person with GPS on their phone, fog is an annoyance. It delays flights, it slows down traffic. To a Viking navigator in the year 1000 AD, fog was a spiritual and existential crisis. Imagine you are the captain, the steerman. You are responsible for the lives of 30 men. You are in the middle of the open ocean, 1,000 miles from Norway and 1,000 miles from Greenland. You have no compass. You have no map. You have been steering by the sun during the day and the North Star Polaris at night. Then the world turns white. The fog banks in the North Atlantic are legendary. They can last for days, sometimes weeks. The horizon vanishes. The sky vanishes. The water turns into a gray mirror that blends perfectly with the air. You lose all sense of direction. You don't know where north is. You don't know if you are sailing in a straight line or sailing in a giant slow circle that will end with everyone starving to death. Panic is a contagion. In the silence of the fog, where sound travels strangely and the only noise is the creaking of the sodden hull, the crew begins to whisper. They are wet, they are rotting from salt sores, and now they are blind. This is the moment where mutinies are born. This is the moment where the ship becomes a coffin. But the steersman does not panic. He reaches into a small leather pouch hanging from his belt. He pulls out a rock. It doesn't look like much. It looks like a piece of broken glass or dirty ice. It is a crystal of calcite, known geologically as Iceland spar. But in the sagas, it has a different name. They called it Solarstein, the Sunstone. For decades, modern historians thought this was a myth. They thought the stories of Vikings finding the sun in a cloudy sky were just magic tales like dragons or trolls. But then, archaeologists found a crystal on an Elizabethan shipwreck in the Channel Islands. And then, physicists started testing these rocks in the lab. What they found changed our understanding of the ancient world. The Vikings weren't using magic. They were using advanced optical physics. Here is how it works. Light from the sun is not just brightness, it has direction. When sunlight hits the atmosphere, it scatters. But even on a cloudy day, or in a thick fog, the light waves from the sun maintain a specific orientation .910. This is called polarization. The human eye is blind to polarization. We just see gray. But the Iceland spar crystal is not blind. It has a property called birefringence or double refraction. When you look through a piece of Iceland spar, you don't see one image. You see two. The crystal splits the light beam into two separate rays. If you hold the crystal up to the gray foggy sky and rotate it, one of those images will get brighter while the other gets darker. The Viking navigator would stand on the deck, surrounded by the terrifying white void. He would hold the crystal up to his eye. He would slowly rotate the stone, scanning the overhead gray soup. He was looking for the sweet spot, the exact angle where the two images in the crystal became equal in brightness. At that precise moment, the crystal is aligned with the hidden sun. He would mark that direction. He would locate the invisible sun behind the cloud's dot. And once he knew where the sun was, he knew where south was. And if he knew south, he knew north. It was a piece of technology that allowed them to hack the atmosphere. While every other sailor in Europe was blind and helpless in the fog, the Vikings could see the geometry of the sky. Imagine the scene on the deck. The crew is huddled in their wet wool, terrified. The captain stands up, holding a glowing stone to the sky like a wizard. He finds the light. He points the steering oar. The ship corrects its course. The panic subsides. This crystal was more valuable than gold. It was the key to the Atlantic. It allowed them to sail in seasons and weather conditions that would kill anyone else. It is the reason they could reach America 500 years before Columbus, who relied on the magnetic compass and clear skies. But the sunstone had a limit. It could tell you where the sun was. It could tell you which way was west, but it could not tell you the one thing you desperately needed to know. How far away is the land? You can sail west for a month, perfectly on course, and still die if there is no land in front of you. You can be 10 miles from an island and sail right past it in the fog because you can't see it. The sunstone solved the orientation problem, but it didn't solve the proximity problem. To find the land before they crashed into it, or before they starved, they needed a different kind of sensor. They needed a radar system. And since they didn't have electronics, they used biology. They outsourced the navigation to creatures that had evolved to survive in this hellscape for millions of years. As the fog lifts, the Viking navigator puts the stone away and looks at the water. He isn't looking at the waves. He is looking for a specific beast. A beast that acts as a living signpost. If you see a bird, you might be lucky. If you see a whale, you might be saved. But you have to know which whale. Let's enter the final phase of the voyage. The biological radar. The sunstone has done its job. You know where west is. But west is a direction, not a destination. You can sail west for eternity until the world runs out of water or you run out of life. The Atlantic Ocean is a desert. It is millions of square miles of nothing. And in the year 1000 AD, there is no GPS to tell you, you are 50 miles from the coast. You could be right next to Iceland, or you could be drifting past it into the open void towards the Arctic ice cap. Navigating by the stars keeps you on a line, but it doesn't tell you where you are on that line. To solve the problem of longitude, to know how close they were to land, the Vikings stopped looking at the sky and started looking at the water. They realized that the ocean is not a uniform dead zone. It is layered with invisible territories. And to read these territories, they used the most advanced sensors available on the planet, animals. The Viking ship was not just a vessel for humans. It was a floating zoo. If you looked closely at the deck of a longship on an exploration voyage, you would see a cage. Inside that cage were ravens. We see ravens in Viking art on their banners, and in their mythology Odin's birds, Hugin and Munin. But on a ship, the raven wasn't a pet or a religious icon. It was a piece of navigational equipment. It was a drone. Here's the logic. Seabirds like gulls or puffins are useless to a navigator in the deep ocean because they can sleep on the water. Seeing a seagull doesn't mean land is near. It just means a seagull is hungry. But a raven is a land bird. It cannot swim. It cannot float. If a raven lands on the ocean, it drowns. Therefore, a raven will never ever fly away from the ship unless it is absolutely certain there is dry land to land on. The Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, describes the technique used by the famous Floki Vilhjalmsson. He took 3 ravens. When he thought he might be getting close to land, he released the first raven. The bird flew up the mast, gained altitude to see the horizon, circled, and then flew straight back to the ship. This told the navigator, there is no land. We are still in the void. A few days later, he released the second raven. It flew up, circled, flew away for a bit, but then got scared and returned to the ship. This meant there might be something, but it's too far. Finally, he released the third raven. It flew up, circled, and then shot forward like an arrow, disappearing over the horizon. The navigator didn't need to see the land. He just needed to follow the bird. The raven's survival instinct was more accurate than any map. The crew would turn the prow of the ship to follow the flight path, rowing with renewed energy, knowing that the bird had seen the coast. But birds were not the only signal. The Vikings were masters of reading the whale road. The ocean is full of cetaceans, but they don't swim randomly. Different species of whales inhabit different depths. The Vikings categorized whales not just by size, but by location. If they saw a pod of pilot whales or porpoises, they knew they were likely in shallower coastal waters or near a continental shelf. If they saw large, solitary deep water whales, they knew they were still in the abyss. They also looked for the feeding frenzy. In the North Atlantic, where the cold Arctic currents mix with warmer southern waters, massive blooms of plankton occur. These blooms attract fish, which attract birds and whales. A convergence of life on the surface was a lighthouse. It indicated a current, and currents often wrap around land masses. Then, there were the senses of the men themselves. After weeks at sea, breathing nothing but sterile, salty air, the human nose becomes hypersensitive. The Vikings claimed they could smell the land days before they could see it. This sounds like folklore, but it is scientifically plausible. In the summer, the pine forests of Scandinavia and the peat bogs of the British Isles release massive amounts of terpenes and pollen into the air. If the wind is blowing off the land, this scent can travel for dozens of miles out to sea. To a sailor whose olfactory system has been scrubbed clean by ozone and salt, the sudden faint scent of pine resin or burning wood was a physical shock. It triggered a primal reaction. Safety is near. They also use their ears. A deep ocean swell sounds different than a coastal wave. In the deep ocean, the swell is a long, rolling rhythm. As the water gets shallower the continental shelf, the wave period shortens. The water becomes choppier. An experienced steersman could hear the change in the slap of the water against the hull. He could feel the change in the vibration of the keel through his feet. They even read the clouds. Navigators looked for land blink. Over snow-covered land or glaciers like Iceland or Greenland, the white surface reflects sunlight upwards, illuminating the underside of the clouds. This creates a bright white patch on the bottom of a cloud bank, distinct from the dark gray reflection of the open ocean. If you saw a white glow on the clouds on the horizon, you knew there was ice or snow beneath it. Conversely, over ice-free land in the summer, the ground warms up faster than the sea. This creates rising columns of warm air thermals that form stationary cumulus clouds. If you see a line of fluffy clouds that isn't moving with the wind, there is an island underneath them holding them in place. By combining all these data points, the flight of the raven, the species of the whale, the smell of the wind, the feel of the swell, and the color of the clouds, the Viking navigator built a mental map of the invisible world. And then the moment happens, the fog lifts, or the sun rises, and there, on the jagged line of the horizon, is a darker shade of gray. It isn't a cloud, it has hard edges. The cry goes up, land. The psychological shift on the ship is instant. The shivering stops mattering. The salt sores stop hurting. The hunger is forgotten. The adrenaline dumps into the bloodstream. They have cheated death. They have crossed the impossible void. But as they draw closer to the shore, the relief turns into a new kind of tension. Seeing land and landing on it are two very different things. In the modern world, ships go to ports. They have docks. They have pilots to guide them in. The Vikings were sailing into the unknown. They were approaching jagged, rocky coastlines with no charts, no lighthouses, and no depth sounders. The coast of the North Atlantic is a graveyard of ships. Hidden rocks, rip currents, and sudden shoals can tear the bottom out of a longship in seconds. If you wreck the ship 100 meters from the beach in freezing water, you still die. You drown in sight of salvation. The steersman now has to make the most critical decisions of the voyage. He has to read the surf. He has to find a strand, a beach gentle enough to slide the keel up onto the sand. They drop the sail, they man the oars. The ship transforms from a sailing vessel back into a rowing machine. They need precise control. The rhythmic thud of the oars replaces the hiss of the wind. They thread the needle between the breakers, and then the sound that every Viking sailor dreams of. Not the sound of battle, not the sound of gold coins, but the sound of wood grinding against gravel. Scrur ap, the ship stops. Men jump over the side, into the surf, waist deep in water. But they don't care. They grab the gunwales and heave. Using the last reserves of their caloric energy, they drag the ton of oak and iron up onto the dry stones, out of the reach of the tide. They collapse on the beach. They are on solid ground. The world has stopped moving. But as they lie there, gasping for air, looking up at the strange trees of a new land, they realize something. The survival phase at sea is over, but the survival phase on land has just begun. They are cold. They are wet. They are exhausted. And they are in a foreign territory that might be inhabited by hostile forces. The first rule of landing is not to explore. It is not to loot. The first rule is the one they have been denying themselves for weeks. The rule that was forbidden on the ship. They need to make the spark. They need to summon the god that was banned from the deck. They need fire. The keel is buried in the sand. The oars are stowed. The ocean, which has been trying to kill you for 3 weeks, is finally behind you. You step off the wooden deck and onto the stones of the beach. And immediately you fall over. It isn't exhaustion, although you are exhausted. It is land sickness. For 20 days, your inner ear has calibrated itself to the violent rolling of the North Atlantic. Your brain has learned to compensate for a floor that is constantly tilting. Now that the floor is solid rock, your brain is still correcting for waves that aren't there. The world spins. The ground feels like it is heaving up to hit you in the face. Watching a crew of fierce Viking warriors stumble around a beach like drunkards would be comical if their condition wasn't so desperate. They are ashore. But they are not safe. They are wet, freezing, and standing on the edge of an unknown wilderness, possibly Vinland, possibly Ireland, possibly an uninhabited rock in the Faroes. The priority is not to scout for enemies. The priority is not to hunt. The priority is the one act that has been forbidden by the laws of the ship since they left home. The ban is lifted. The cold iron rule is over. It is time to make the spark. One of the thralls or a junior crewman brings the dry tinder box, kept waterproof inside a waxed leather bag deep in the hull. He brings the flint and the steel striker. His hands are shaking, partly from the cold, partly from the adrenaline of the landing. Striking a fire with numb, frost-nipped fingers is agony. You lack the dexterity to hold the flint. You drop it. You curse. You try again. Clack. Clack. Then it happens. A tiny orange spark lands on the charred linen or dried fungus. A wisp of smoke. A glow. He blows on it gently. The glow turns into a flame. He feeds it birch bark. Then twigs. Then driftwood found on the beach. In minutes, a roaring bonfire is blazing on the shoreline. To the modern camper, a fire is nice. To a Viking crew just off a blue water crossing, this fire is a religious experience. It is the resurrection of the sun. Men who haven't felt external warmth in a month crowd around the flames, dangerously close, almost singing their eyebrows. They don't just want to warm their hands, they want to purge the cold from their marrow. But the fire is just the engine for the real work. The camp must be built. And the camp is the ship itself. The Vikings didn't carry tents and backpacks. The ship was the mobile home. In some cases, if they were staying for a long time, they might drag the entire ship up the beach and flip it over, turning the hull into a long wooden roof. But usually, they would leave the ship upright, braced with logs. They would take the massive woolen sail, the one that drove them across the sea, and drape it over the ship like a tent fly, creating a triangular shelter that ran the length of the deck. This was the Jald. Now, the chemistry changes. On the ocean, the Jald was just a windbreak. On land, with a fire pit built carefully nearby, or even inside if the ventilation was managed, the space under the sail transforms. It captures the heat. The temperature inside rises from freezing to comfortable. And then begins the great drying. This is the most pungent moment of the journey. The crew strips off. They take off the woolen tunics that have been soaked in salt water, sweat, and fish oil for weeks. They take off the socks that have been rotting on their feet. They hang them on makeshift racks near the fire. As the heat hits the wet wool, it steams. The smell of a Viking landing camp would have been horrific to modern noses. A thick, suffocating cloud of wet dog, rancid seal fat, unwashed human bodies, and wood smoke. But to them, it was the scent of survival. Drying the clothes was critical. Wet wool is heavy. Dry wool is light. Wet leather cuts the skin. Dry leather protects it. They would massage tallow and fresh fat into their boots to restore the waterproofing that the salt had stripped away. They were rebooting their equipment. But the most profound healing happened to their bodies. We talked about the seesore and the trench foot in Chapter 5. The rewarming process is painful, but it is necessary. As the blood flows back into the extremities without the constant constriction of the cold, the healing begins. They would use the fresh water found on land to wash the salt crust off their skin. This simple act, washing the salt away, stops the ulcers from growing. The stinging stops. The skin begins to breathe again, and then the kettle comes out. The great iron cauldron, which had sat cold and useless in the bilge for the whole voyage, is suspended over the fire on a tripod. For the first time in weeks, they are not eating cold butter and raw fish. They pour water from a local stream into the pot. They add the stockfish, but this time it boils. The heat breaks down the tough fibers, turning the wood like jerky into a soft, flaky soup. They add flour to make a thick porridge. Maybe they add wild onions or herbs found near the beach. The first spoonful of hot food is a shock to the system. You can feel the heat traveling down your throat, into your stomach, and radiating outward to your limbs. It is a narcotic. The food coma that follows a hot meal after weeks of cold rations is instantaneous. The energy that the body was using to fight the cold is suddenly released. The adrenaline crashes. Men fall asleep right there on the sand, still chewing, wrapped in their now drying cloaks. This sleep is different from the sleep on the ship. The leather cocoon and the tactical spooning are no longer necessary for survival, though old habits die hard. They can spread out. They can sleep alone. The ground doesn't move. The wind doesn't spray them. The silence of the land, the absence of the constant roar of the ocean, is deafening. But this moment of peace is the most dangerous moment of the expedition. They are warm. They are full. They are dry. And they are asleep. A fire on a beach is a beacon. In the pitch black of the ancient world, a bonfire can be seen for miles. If there are people in this new land, Saxons, Skraeling's Inuits / Native Americans, or rival Vikings, they know you are here. The cold iron discipline of the ship has to be replaced by the cold steel discipline of the warrior. The steerman captain cannot let everyone sleep. He has to post sentries. These men have to stand away from the fire, out in the cold dark, looking away from the light. If you look at the fire, you lose your night vision. You become blind to the arrow flying out of the darkness. This transition from the struggle against nature to the struggle against other humans marks the end of the voyage and the beginning of the raid or the settlement. The ship, which was their torture chamber, is now their fortress. It is their base of operations. But it is also their only way home. As they sit by the fire, repairing their shoes and sharpening their swords, they look back at the dark ocean. They know something terrifying. To get home, to see their families again, to spend their silver, they have to do it all over again. They have to put the fire out. They have to get back in the freezing water. They have to return to the cold. But that is a problem for the future. Tonight, there is fire. Tonight, there is heat. Tonight, they are the masters of the elements. This cycle of freezing and thawing, of suffering and recovering, created a specific kind of mindset. It created a culture that didn't fear discomfort, because they knew it was temporary. They knew that the warmth of the fire feels infinitely better when you have frozen for it. But what happened when they reached a land where the trees didn't grow? When they reached the ultimate destination where there was no wood to burn? How did they heat their homes in the treeless wastelands of Greenland and Iceland? The story of Viking heat isn't just about ships. It's about how they terraformed their environment to survive on the edge of the habitable world. Let's look at the final innovation, the fuel that wasn't wood. You have survived the ocean crossing. You have landed your ship on the black volcanic sands of Iceland or the rocky fjords of Greenland. You have lit your first fire on the beach to dry your clothes. You feel triumphant. You have conquered the Atlantic. But as the adrenaline fades and you look inland, a terrifying realization settles in. You look at the mountains, you look at the valleys, you look at the rolling green hills, and you notice something missing. There are no trees, or at least not the kind of trees you need. In Norway, the Vikings came from deep, endless forests of pine and oak. Wood was infinite. You could build a house, burn a massive fire all night, and build a new ship without making a dent in the supply. Wood was their plastic, their steel, and their electricity. But Iceland and Greenland are different. The native birch trees are small, twisted, and scrubby. They burn fast and provide little heat. They are useless for building longships or supporting the roof of a heavy turf house. So, the Vikings found themselves in a paradox. They had sailed to a land of ice, where they needed fire more than anywhere else on Earth, but they had left the fuel behind. They were lumberjacks living in a desert. How do you survive a winter that lasts 6 months when you cannot chop down a tree? You have to change your definition of wood. You have to stop looking at the forest and start looking at the ocean again. The first source of fuel in the colonies was a gift from the currents. It is called driftwood. In a strange twist of global geography, the massive rivers of Siberia, thousands of miles away in Russia, wash huge trees into the Arctic Ocean. These trees get caught in the polar ice pack, drift across the top of the world, and eventually, years later, are ejected into the North Atlantic currents. They wash up on the beaches of Iceland and Greenland, stripped of their bark, cured by the salt, and frozen hard as iron. To a Viking settler, finding a massive Siberian larch log on the beach was like finding a bar of gold. This wasn't trash washing up. It was a divine provision. Driftwood became so valuable that it dictated the laws of the land. In the Graga's the Grey Goose laws of the Icelandic Commonwealth, the rights to driftwood were strictly defined. If you owned the land bordering the beach, you owned the wood. If a neighbor came and took a log to heat his home, it wasn't petty theft. It was a crime that could get him outlawed or killed. Wealthy chieftains would control the beaches. Poor farmers were forced to trade their labor or their livestock just to get enough seawood to keep their children from freezing. But driftwood is finite. You cannot burn your house beams just to cook a stew. For the daily fire, the fire that burns 24 hours a day to keep the damp out, they needed something cheaper. They needed a fuel that was everywhere. They started burning the ground itself. They turned to peat moor. If you walk on a bog in northern Europe, the ground feels spongy. Underneath the living grass is a layer of dead, compressed vegetation that has been rotting for thousands of years. It hasn't been under enough pressure to turn into coal, but it is halfway there. Harvesting peat is backbreaking labor. In the short summer, while they should be fishing or raiding, the Vikings had to spend weeks in the bogs. They used special spades to cut rectangular bricks of this wet earth. They would stack them in pyramids to dry in the wind. If you burn wet peat, you get nothing but steam and misery. If you dry it properly, it burns. But it doesn't burn like wood. Wood flames. It crackles. It gives off a bright, cheerful light. Peat smolders. It glows with a dull, intense red heat. And it produces smoke. Thick, heavy, oily smoke. Inside the colonial longhouse, the air quality was atrocious. The chimney hadn't been invented yet or wasn't used in these designs. The smoke from the peat fire would drift up and hang in the roof, creating a permanent smog layer. The Vikings lived their lives crouched below this layer. Archaeologists studying the bones of Vikings from these settlements find the evidence of this fuel inside their bodies. Their sinuses are scarred. Their lungs are damaged. They were slowly smoking themselves like hams. But again, the alternative was freezing. However, in some places, even the peat ran out, or the ground was too frozen to dig. When the wood is gone and the earth is frozen, you have to look at the only other biomass available. You look at the barn. The third fuel of the Viking expansion was dung. It sounds repulsive to modern sensibilities, but dried animal manure is an excellent fuel source. It consists of undigested grass fibers. When a cow or a sheep deposits waste, the Vikings wouldn't just shovel it away. They would collect it, shape it, and dry it in the sun just like the peat. In Iceland, this was called ta. In the winter, when the sheep were kept indoors, the manure would be compacted by their hooves into a hard layer on the floor. In the spring, the farmers would cut this layer out in blocks, dry it, and burn it. The smell of a dung fire is distinctive. It is sweet, acrid, and pungent. It permeates the food cooked over it. It permeates the clothes. A Viking from Iceland smelled very different from a Viking from Norway. One smelled of pine needles, the other smelled of burning sheep waste. But the ultimate adaptation to the treeless dark wasn't about heat. It was about light. In the far north, the sun sets at 3 p.m. in winter. The darkness is crushing. You cannot spin wool, repair weapons, or play games in the pitch black. A fire provides some light, but you can't waste fuel just for illumination. They needed a lamp. But a lamp needs oil. In the Mediterranean, they used olive oil. The Vikings didn't have olives. They had something better. They had seals. The seal was the general store of the north. Its skin made the sleeping bags, hufat, and ropes. Its meat fed the dogs. And its fat, the blubber, was rendered down into lisi, train oil seal, or whale oil. They would take a stone bowl, fill it with this rancid liquid fat, and float a wick made of moss or cotton grass in it. When lit, it produced a yellow, sputtering flame. It smelled like burning fish. It produced a greasy soot that coated the walls and the faces of the people. But it worked. It pushed the darkness back. This reliance on marine oil changed the economy of the settlements. A farm that had access to a seal colony was richer than a farm with good soil. The ability to create light was power. These adaptations, burning driftwood, peat, dung, and blubber, changed the culture. The grandeur of the Norwegian timber halls disappeared. The houses in Greenland became smaller, dug deeper into the ground, built of stone and turf to conserve every single calorie of heat. They essentially recreated the conditions of the ship on land. They lived in small, crowded spaces, huddled together, smelling of fish oil and unwashed bodies, surrounded by a hostile environment. The ship had taught them how to survive discomfort. The land forced them to perfect it. But there is a tragic end to this story. In Greenland, the system eventually failed. The climate got colder, the Little Ice Age. The seals moved south. The driftwood stopped washing up due to changing ice patterns. The peat bogs froze solid. The Vikings in Greenland refused to adapt further. They refused to adopt the technology of the Inuit, who burned blubber in sophisticated soapstone lamps and lived in snow houses. The Vikings clung to their European identity. They wanted to be farmers, not hunters. They wanted to burn grass and wood, not just fat. And so the lights went out. When later explorers reached the Viking settlements in Greenland centuries later, they found them empty. The longhouses were silent. The fires had burned down to cold ash hundreds of years ago. The struggle for heat is the fundamental struggle of the North. It drove their exploration, it dictated their diet, and in the end, it decided their fate. But for the survivors, the Icelanders, the Faroes, and the Scandinavians, the legacy of this struggle lives on. It lives on in their relationship with the cold. They don't fear it. They respect it. And it leads us to the final question. We have looked at the past, at the brutal reality of the ship and the settlement. But what is the legacy of this endurance? How did a people who froze in the dark for centuries end up creating some of the happiest, most comfortable societies on Earth today? Let's conclude our journey by looking at the modern echoes of the Viking fire. We have spent this entire journey shivering. We have stood on the deck of a freezing ship in the North Atlantic. We have slept in bags made of greasy sealskin. We have eaten raw butter and smashed dried fish just to keep our hearts beating. We have looked through magic crystals in the fog and followed ravens to unknown shores. We have asked the question, how did they survive? But now, as we reach the end of the Viking Age, we have to ask a different question. What did this suffering create? The Viking Age didn't just end because of politics or religion. It ended because the world changed. As we moved into the 12th and 13th centuries, the climate began to turn. The medieval warm period that allowed the Vikings to sail open boats to America slowly gave way to the Little Ice Age. The sea ice expanded. The sailing routes to Greenland and America were cut off. The colonies that lived on the edge of the impossible, like the Greenland settlements we discussed in Chapter 9, faded into silence. They died because they couldn't keep the heat on. They died because the calibration between their culture and their environment slipped, and the cold rushed in to fill the gap. But in Scandinavia, Iceland, and the Faroes, the people didn't die. They adapted. And the trauma of those centuries of freezing cold forged a cultural identity that is still the envy of the world today. If you look at the happiest countries in the world, they are consistently the Nordic nations. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland. Why? Why are the people who live in the dark and the cold so happy? The answer lies in the legacy of the longship. The concept is known by many names. In Danish, it is kuge. In Norwegian, it is koselig. We translate these words as cozy, but that is a lazy translation. Hygge isn't just about fluffy blankets and scented candles. It is a survival mechanism. Hygge is the conscious creation of a sanctuary. It is the art of building a warm, lighted circle in the middle of a dark, hostile universe. It is a direct genetic memory of the Longhouse. When a modern Dane lights a candle at breakfast, which they do, or when a Norwegian family gathers by the fireplace after a ski trip, they are reenacting the ritual of the landing. They are acknowledging that outside the walls, the wind is howling, the spray is freezing, and the darkness is absolute. But inside, we have fire. Inside, we have fellowship. The extreme comfort of the modern Nordic home is a reaction to the extreme discomfort of the Viking ship. Because their ancestors spent centuries being wet, cold, and miserable, the descendants have perfected the art of being dry, warm, and safe. They value the heat because they know the cost of the cold. This legacy also lives on in the eternal fire. In Finland, there is a word that doesn't translate sisu. It means a white, knuckled form of courage. It means grit. It is the ability to keep moving forward against impossible odds, even when there is no hope of winning. This is the mindset of the rower on the longship. When the storm is raging and your hands are bleeding and you haven't slept in 2 days, you don't keep rowing because you are motivated. You keep rowing because if you stop, you die. That grim determination, that refusal to freeze, is the bedrock of the northern character. We also see the legacy in their relationship with nature. The Vikings didn't hide from the weather. They immersed themselves in it. Today, Scandinavian parents leave their babies sleeping in strollers outside in sub-zero temperatures. They believe the fresh, cold air makes them stronger. They have a saying, "There is no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothes." This is a direct lesson from the Hushafat and the woolen sail. If your gear is good, the cold cannot hurt you. The environment is not an enemy to be feared. It is a force to be respected and managed. And finally, consider the sauna. The sauna is the spiritual opposite of the open ocean. On the ship, you are wet and cold. In the sauna, you are dry and hot. You roast yourself in temperatures of 80 or 90 degrees Celsius. You sweat out the toxins. You beat your skin with birch branches to stimulate the blood flow, reversing the vasoconstriction of the trench foot. The obsession with the sauna in the north is an ancestral therapy. It is the ritual purging of the deep cold that settles in the bones during the long winter. It is the promise that no matter how deep the frost goes, the fire can drive it out. The Viking ships are gone now. The Drakar that terrified Europe are rotting in museums or buried in burial mounds. The technology has changed. We have central heating. We have Jortex. We have GPS. We don't need sunstones. And we don't need to drink seal oil to survive the commute to work. But the ocean is still there. The North Atlantic is just as cold, just as vast, and just as deadly as it was in the year 1000. If you fell into the water today off the coast of Newfoundland, you would die just as quickly as Leif Erikson would have. The only difference is the shell we build around ourselves. The story of the Vikings is not just a story of swords and shields. It is a story of thermodynamics. It is the story of how a species of tropical apes, who evolved on the savannas of Africa, managed to hack their biology to survive in the cryosphere. They did it with engineering. They did it with chemistry. They did it with a diet that would kill a modern man. But mostly, they did it with a mindset. They accepted that comfort was a luxury, but survival was a duty. They learned that the only heat you can truly rely on is the heat you generate yourself, and the heat you share with the person standing next to you. So, the next time you turn up the thermostat in your house, or complain that your coffee has gone lukewarm, take a moment to remember the crew of the dragon ship. Remember the men who stood in the freezing spray for weeks without a fire. Remember the leather cocoon. Remember the taste of rancid butter. And be grateful for the fire. Be grateful for the roof. Be grateful that you are warm. Because for 1,000 years, warmth was the greatest treasure on earth. Thank you for sailing with us on this frozen journey. If you survived all 10 chapters, you are now an honorary member of the crew. I want to know in the comments below, could you have done it? Could you have endured the no fire rule for 3 weeks on the open ocean? Or would you have risked the ship just to warm your hands? Let us know. And until next time, keep your powder dry and your fire burning.